Well, when we talked to most of the people there, in fact, we went to a polling group that said of the top 10 major concerns of the Yemeni people, Al-Qaeda did not even appear.
The official words that they use, that I think Attorney General Holder used in his memo describing it, are chilling. He said, of the 4 Americans who we've executed without trial and without charge, only one of them was specifically targeted.
Hello, my name is Stanley Heller. Welcome to The Struggle. The Struggle is shown on 21 cable stations from Vermont to New York City and on the internet at thestruggle.org. Medea Benjamin was in Connecticut in July to speak in Hartford and New Haven. She received international attention for her conversation with President Obama during his national security speech in May. She spoke about drones and Guantanamo. I interviewed her just before she spoke in New Haven, and we start the program with that conversation. On July 18th, the New York Times published an amazing piece by a former Fulbright scholar and government minister of the country of Yemen. His son and grandson were American citizens. Both were killed by U.S. drones. In his op-ed, Nasser al-Awlaki asks why his 16-year-old grandson was killed. Now, we link to this article from our website. We bring it up because on our show today, we have a piece with film director Rick Rowley, who arranged for journalist Jeremy Scahill to interview Nasser al-Awlaki for his recent movie Dirty Wars. Rowley spoke along with Medea Benjamin in Hartford on July 13th. Then more on your growing loss of rights with climate activist Anthony Sorge talking about how authorities acted against a very peaceable group of environmental activists. And a spot from 350.org called Summer Heat. We end with a video about protest of the acquittal of the man who killed Trayvon Martin. I'm going to be speaking with Medea Benjamin, one of the co-founders of Code Pink, an enormously influential activist whose creative tactics have really sparked up the movement, and who last was with the president in a very unique conversation in May, but more recently she's been to Yemen. Good afternoon.
Good to be with you, Stan.
So you talked to the president in that interrupted manner, and of course the big issues with drones and Guantanamo, and then you went over to Yemen. So tell us a bit about what you saw there.
Well, it's interesting that Yemen is a country that is key both for the U.S. drone policy as well as Guantanamo. The majority of prisoners in Guantanamo are from Yemen, and aside from Afghanistan and Pakistan, the largest number of drone strikes are in Yemen. So we went with both issues in mind to speak to members of the government, families on both of the issues, human rights activists, and we had quite a remarkable trip and found a number of groups, particularly young people, who are active on both of these issues, doing very good work.
Now, you also talked to some government people, but in your talk yesterday, you didn't seem too impressed. You talked about they had a dictator and then he's out, but they sort of shuffled the deck.
Well, right. It's the vice president who is now the president. He wants to keep a good relationship with the United States because they get, I think it's $175 million in military aid and $175 million in economic aid, which is a lot of money for this very poor country. And so he wants to keep on good terms. Part of that means to keep giving the green light for the U.S. to use its drones, and also to, in general, toe the U.S. line about Al-Qaeda being a major threat, Well, when we talked to most of the people there, in fact, we went to a polling group that said of the top 10 major concerns of the Yemeni people, Al-Qaeda did not even appear.
And one of the issues is that reporter. There, we were watching yesterday the movie Dirty Wars that Jeremy Scahill featured in, and he talked about an attack in Yemen that killed a lot of people, and a intrepid Yemeni reporter talked about it and then found himself thrown in jail. Could you talk a bit about that?
Yes, this is a reporter named Abdullah Haider Shea, and he, after revealing the U.S. involvement in this massacre, ended up in jail, accused of collaborating with Al-Qaeda, and he was supposed to be released from jail, pardoned by the president, except that the president got a phone call from President Obama asking him to keep the journalist in jail, and that journalist is in jail to this day under very difficult conditions, suffering a lot. We tried to meet with him when we were there, but the government wouldn't allow us.
I mean, it was so extraordinary in the film, talking. Scahill hears this thing. Well, the journalist who broke the story is in jail, and he's only in jail because the president of the United States called and said he should stay there. And he says, well, that didn't sound right. And then the next thing you know, he goes to a White House website and, oh, yeah, it's right there. President asked him to keep this guy in jail.
No, it's quite extraordinary, and you can imagine the kind of pall it puts on the entire journalist community in Yemen, afraid to speak out about these issues.
Let's talk a bit about Guantanamo. We've done some audio interviews, which people can see at The Struggle, or here, I should say, at thestruggle.org. And one thing we got into was the business of the people who have been cleared for release, though I think they call that on the Pentagon people approved for transition. And then you said there was 3 different categories. I mean, who are these people? What do they think about them?
Of the 166 prisoners left in Guantanamo, 86 of them have been cleared for release. As I said, the majority of them come from Yemen. 56 of those come from Yemen. These are people who have been cleared by the Department of Justice, Department of Defense, the CIA, Homeland Security, FBI, by every agency in the government that has something to do with the war on terror. And so you would think that at this point they could be let out of prison. Unfortunately, the president doesn't want to use his political capital for that, and so blames it on the Congress and said, oh, they've put all these measures in place, I can't do that. It's not true, because the Senate purposely put in a waiver system that the president can use that says that it's in the national interest of our government to release these people. So the president has the authority to do it, won't do it, and part of our being in Yemen was to talk to the families about this, to figure out how we could put more pressure on the president. For the first time ever, we got the U.S. ambassador to meet with some of the family members. That had never happened before. There's going to be a hearing in Congress at the end of July, and we're asking the family members to submit testimony to the Congressional Committee. So we formed a relationship with a group that works with these family members, and I think it can help put more pressure on the administration.
But still, nothing has happened. I mean, those Yemenis still sit in the prison. I mean, I love that the business of the national interest. It's sort of like get out of jail free or time out, you know. You have these laws. I mean, I'm just sort of thinking about the Egyptian situation and the military taking over, and you know, that's considered a coup, and U.S. foreign aid is supposedly to be chopped off at that point, and then somebody gets up and says, well, we don't think it's in the national interest, and ooh, these are the magic words, and you can suspend the Constitution.
Well, that's what's happened post 9/11, but it can also be used in a positive way if the president wanted, and I think we could certainly make a very good argument that the kind of animosity against the United States that comes from keeping people indefinitely detained in Guantanamo is not good for the American people, and it would be in our national interest to make some effort to try to obey the rule of law that we say we do as a democracy.
My last question would be about attitudes of Americans towards drones. In your talk yesterday, you said that the sentiment has changed over the last couple of years.
Yeah, when there was a poll taken in February 2012, it showed that 83% of Americans thought it was fine to use drones to kill, quote, terrorist suspects, which is somebody who's never been convicted of anything. And a year later, it was down about 30 points. So we still have a majority of Americans who think that it's a good policy. But I think if we keep doing this work, we're going to soon have a minority. And that's important because you need to change public opinion if you're trying to change policy.
And lastly, you've written a book about drones. Can you give us its title?
It's called Drone Warfare, Killing by Remote Control.
Thanks a lot. Dirty Wars follows Jeremy Scahill as he exposes U.S. secret wars around the world. There are two interviews with Nasser al-Awlaki. Once after his son, who had turned radical al-Qaeda firebrand, is killed by a U.S. drone, and then later when his grandson is killed by another drone. The film gives no real explanation of why the grandson was killed. The U.S. government gives no explanation. I asked film director Rick Rowley what he thought happened.
You know, Jeremy and I have been struggling since Abdul Rahman was killed to find an answer to that question of why. And you know, the only time I've ever heard his name mentioned on Capitol Hill was when Medea shouted it out to the president to interrupt his national security threats. And you know, the terrible thing is that we still don't know, and no one, I mean, the administration has not come forward with an explanation as to why. I mean, the official words that they use, that I think Attorney General Holder used in his memo describing it, are chilling. He said, of the 4 Americans who we've executed without trial and without charge, only one of them was specifically targeted. So 3 of them were not specifically targeted. Now, what does that mean? Does that mean it was the wrong person in the wrong time? You know, we thought they were someone else who killed them. Does that mean that they were collateral damage? Does that mean that they were the victim of a signature strike? So, I mean, a signature strike is, for me, the most, is the sign of just the total bankruptcy of this program. The CIA has given themselves the authority to execute people in what they call signature strikes, which are strikes in which they don't know the name or identity of anyone who's being killed. We're based on a pattern of behavior, and we don't know what that pattern of behavior is. It's all classified. I mean, so if you're a military-age male, if you're a male between the ages of 16 and 60 in certain parts of Yemen or Pakistan, and you exhibit some form of behavior, maybe that's gathering in a group of 12 people, maybe that's doing jumping jacks in the desert, maybe that's getting into an SUV and driving. You don't know what that is, but then you can be executed by the CIA and then posthumously deemed a militant and counted on the tally of bad guys who this administration has killed, not civilian casualties. That shows, I mean, first of all, just it's totally morally bankrupt, completely illegal, and deeply counterproductive. I mean, it shows we're blind on the ground. We know nothing about the people who were fighting, the people who were killing, the countries in which we're operating. We have no human intelligence. If we're forced to resort to killing anonymous people and then naming the militants when they're dead. So which one of those was Abdul Rahman? Which one are they saying he was? What one was he really? I mean, I wish we lived in a country that was transparent enough that we could have an answer to that question, and the family deserves an answer to that question.
Just a comment, one slight perhaps difference would be to say that you said the CIA gave themselves. President Obama gave the CIA, and President Obama has given JSOC the right to use signature strikes. And I think we've got to make it clear that there is a way to stop this. And that would be President Obama say no signature strike. President Obama say no double taps. President Obama say the CIA is a civilian organization. It shouldn't be in the business of whole-scale killing. Just like President Obama has the right to clear the 86 prisoners in Guantanamo who have already been cleared for release, he could open those doors immediately and release them, just like President Obama could tell Eric Holder to stop prosecuting Eric Snowden, just like President Obama could do something about Bradley Manning, who faces the rest of his life in prison. So it's not all on one man, but let's not let him off the hook.
At a Connecticut forum on civil liberties, Anthony Sorge talked about spying on an environmental group trying to work to maintain a livable climate.
Okay, I'm Anthony Sorge. I'm with a group called Capitalism versus the Climate, and I'm going to talk a little bit about some examples of surveillance and repression of the environmental movement, for lack of a better term. So I wanted to talk about examples of this surveillance and repression of groups that are a little bit more moderate and maybe a little bit more relevant to folks in the room or people involved in broader struggles. So the first case I want to talk about is dealing with a group in Pennsylvania called the Gas Drilling Awareness Coalition, and I can't really emphasize enough how moderate this group is. They're in Pennsylvania, which is kind of the heart of fracking country right now, and if you listen to President Obama's recent climate speech, you're aware of this tremendous push for natural gas development, specifically through hydrofracking. So this group in Pennsylvania is attempting to simply raise awareness about the negative effects of hydrofracking on their communities and in terms of climate change. They call themselves a nonprofit community educational association. They don't engage in acts of civil disobedience or really even have a very radical perspective on hydrofracking. They just kind of want to have a little bit more of transparency with the process and maybe some reform and regulation. Which makes it really surprising that in September of 2010, one of the members of the GDAC received an email that was mistakenly sent to him. The person who sent it thought that he was sympathetic to the industry and not actually like in a movement against it. That's how moderate this group is. So this email was actually sent from the director of the Pennsylvania Department of Homeland Security. And in this email, he basically kind of revealed that this group, the GDAC, was being watched by the FBI, by local and federal law enforcement, by industry folks, by private security firms. And kind of most notably by a group called the Marcellus Shale Coalition, who signed a $900,000 lobbying contract with Ridge Global, which is a private security firm founded by Tom Ridge, who was the head of Homeland Security under George W. Bush. So this was really surprising to the group, and what was also surprising is that in the documents and in some of the language from these groups that were surveilling them, they learned that they had been given a low to moderate threat rating in reference to a public meeting that anti-drilling activists planned to attend, and there was a suggestion from the surveillance community that an attack is likely and might well be executed by this group. Another quote that was that kind of emerged in this process was, "The escalating conflict over natural gas drilling in Pennsylvania may define local fault lines and potentially increase area environmentalist activity or eco-terrorism." This surveillance had a real chilling effect on the GDAC. They noticed that attendance at their meetings started to go down. People who were going to meetings were leaving their cell phones in the car or like taking the batteries out of their phones. There was this general paranoia about like wiretaps and email surveillance. People felt they were being followed. And this is just regular, average, run-of-the-mill community folks who were being targeted for this high-level surveillance. What's significant about this is that the surveillance state deemed the education that this group was providing, the kind of like informational materials this group was providing, as having the ability to foment some kind of militant eco-terrorist action. And that's kind of relevant for the next case I want to talk about, which has to do with Rising Tide North America. Rising Tide North America is certainly not as moderate as the GDAC. They are actually the broader group that Capitalism versus the Climate is a part of. They use direct action to confront the root causes of climate change. And one particular chapter of the group in North Texas was targeted by the FBI and Americans for Prosperity, which is a Koch-funded lobbying group. There was an anonymous tip to look into a prominent activist in the group named Ben Kessler, who's an Afghanistan war vet and a pretty vocal member of the group. He was interviewed by the FBI, and the FBI assured him that they respected his free speech, but were worried about things being taken to an extreme level. That's not super surprising that Kessler was questioned by the FBI and kind of targeted in that way. What was more surprising is that one of his former professors at the University of North Texas, a guy named Adam Briggle, who teaches a class on the ethics of nonviolence and the history of the environmental movement, was also kind of targeted by the FBI. And there was a request made by the Texas Director of Americans for Prosperity for the University of North Texas to turn over 1,300 emails that he had written and received relevant to hydrofracking and environmental issues, which they did. When Briggle was questioned by the FBI, they asked him about his knowledge of IEDs. Obviously something that's like never been relevant to a group like Rising Tide, or even really the most militant like environmental groups. So again, an example of a guy who is not even really an activist, but is more of an educator and an academic who is being targeted because the information, the education he's providing could possibly lead to these acts of eco-terrorism that the surveillance state is really worried about. The last case I want to talk about has to do with a group called Bold, Nebraska. They're a group that is, again, kind of fighting some frontline environmental issues in Nebraska. Small town local landowners there are pretty friendly with local law enforcement, and local law enforcement told them that there was a meeting at one of the fusion centers that were just mentioned with TransCanada, the kind of like the company that's in charge of the Keystone XL tar sands oil pipeline. This meeting involved TransCanada, involved local law enforcement folks, it involved like industry folks, and some documents that were released under a Freedom of Information Act request showed that there was some in-depth discussion about prominent members of 350.org, Tar Sands Blockade, Rainforest Action Network, who were all referred to as environmental extremists, all nonviolent groups. And along with the Pledge of Resistance that 60,000 people signed saying that they'll commit acts of civil disobedience if Obama passes the KXL plan. So again, this is an example of some pretty heavy surveillance of what are not super militant environmental groups. There was also a recent article put out by The Guardian that was talking about how the U.S. National Security Strategy, the DoD's Army Modernization Strategy, a study by the RAND Corp, all talk about how the military is preparing for a high level of civil unrest as economic conditions get worse and environmental catastrophe seems more and more likely. They're conducting war games of like domestic military operations in the event of food and water crises or other kind of environmental catastrophes. So this stuff is happening, and it's happening with in the environmental movement, certainly, but as was mentioned, Occupy has faced the same level of surveillance, and so has any social justice movement that's had any teeth for the for all of history, really. So I think what's important to take away from this is that we have to be aware that this is happening, even if we consider ourselves members of very moderate, above ground, non-radical activist groups. We have to be aware that there's a very good likelihood of this kind of surveillance affecting us.
Today could be one of the hottest days ever recorded on Earth.
Dry, windy conditions and record hot triple-digit temperatures. that we're seeing more extreme weather, bigger storms more often. It is very much the new normal.
What the fossil fuel industry is doing is locking us into a future that we can't survive.
We are at a tipping point in America's history for this environmental movement.
On our site, several videos from an angry protest in New Haven over the acquittal of the man who killed Trayvon Martin. Time today just for one of those videos.
22 years ago, I had my son in my arms, and he was only about 1.5 years old. And I told that crowd that I wanted to be able to tell my son that he's not going to come and he's not going to be raised up in a society where he has to fear for what happens for him in his life. It's 22 years ago, nothing has changed. Right. Nothing has changed. I called my son up in Philadelphia and I spoke to him. I told him, I don't know what to tell you right now, Will. I don't have an answer for you right now because I'm hurt in my soul right now about being a black man again in America and not being heard and being treated the same way. I've been in shackles before. Why? For being black. Why? Because I fit a description. What description? Did I fit the description of this white man right here? No, I didn't. I fit the description of what they profiled me to be. And because of that, it continues to happen in this world, and it hasn't changed. 30 years ago, 40 years ago, 50 years ago, we prayed on this stuff with Martin Luther King. Praying didn't change much. It has to be something bigger than praying. It has to be something bigger than another politician coming up here and promising something that doesn't change. The only way this changes is through action, not through promising me another change in life. It has to be something bigger than that.
That's our program for today. See you next week at this time. I'm Stanley Heller, and this is The Struggle.